So once again, thank you so much, Ryoko. And let's move on to the next presentation, which is by Thom Scott Phillips. Could you please, I guess you'd like to share your screen, Tom. So yes, so the title is visible. We can see the presentation. So the floor is yours.
Yes, we're good. We're ready to go. Thank you very much. It's nice to see you all. This is a presentation about the fundamental theory. It draws on two papers, recent papers of mine, the first of those at the bottom of the screen in particular. And maybe some of what I'm going to say is, for some people, uncontroversial. I'm pretty sure that at least some of this is new for some, and I hope it's useful. That's my main goal. And so I have two primary goals. First, a small, very small, but I think a subtle and useful respecification of the notion of ostension that better captures its natural character. And second, I'm going to suggest that the communicative principle of relevance can be usefully respecified as a pair of empirical claims. There's no difference in the content of the communicative principle of relevance, but I think it's useful to respecify as a pair of claims there. And there are a number of other observations and contributions along the way. Okay, so I start from the observation. As I understand things, anything humans can do, they can do in an ostensive fashion. We walk, we talk, we extend our arms, for example, and we extend our arms just because we're doing things in the world. But sometimes we extend our arms in certain ways and in a certain fashion, a bit of exaggeration, for instance, and it becomes a point. So there's a difference between extending an arm and a point. And, sometimes we just walk down the street, but sometimes you can walk in a certain way that might suggest a bit of sarcasm or a bit of irony, some attitude that you might want to reveal to someone. Anything humans can do, they can do in, well, informally we would call it communicative, but more precisely ostensive. In this image here, somebody is picking coffee beans out of a pot. Arguably, they're not just picking coffee beans out of a pot, they're doing so in an ostensive manner because they're showing, their hand is angled towards the viewer, and arguably they mean something like, here are some coffee beans, but of course exactly what they might mean depends on the context. Ostension is, however, classically characterized as a behavior. So if you go back to the 1986 book, we will call such behavior ostensive behavior or simply ostension. And then more overtly in the recent paper by Sperber and Wilson, dealing with developmental and comparative issues in particular, they say that ostension is a type of action. And you see the same idea that ostension is behavior or action also in the literature. Again, developmental and comparative perspectives are important here, where people talk about ostensive cues, as if certain behaviors in the world just are ostension. Eye gaze is one classic go-to example. Motherese is another for infants. Pointing is another that's often discussed. These behaviors simply are treated as ostension by being the behavior that they are. I'm not sure that's quite right. I think it's better to characterize ostension not as behaviors, but as a property that behaviors can have. So humans do all sorts of behaviors. Some of them have the property of being ostensive, and more specifically, it's the property of being motivated by a communicative intention. So obviously, a great deal of what we do is not motivated by communicative intentions, but some of what we do is motivated that way. And that means that ostension is a property, and more precisely, it's a cognitive property. There's no intrinsic or special surface feature of any behavior that makes it ostensive or not. What makes it ostensive is the underlying cognitive trigger. The remarkable thing, stunning thing about our species is that even though there is no given behavioral marker of ostension, we are still able to pick it out in the world. We're still able to reveal it as expressors or communicators, and as audiences, we're able to pick it out in the world, even though it is ultimately a cognitive phenomenon. And that leads me to, I just wanted to sketch here how I think about the whole, the broader class of ostensive behaviors and how language use fits into the picture. Pragmatics in the raw is an expression I've taken from Mike Tomasello. Anything humans can do, they can be pragmatic with if they so wish. Some of those things, however, when they're used repeatedly across a range of different occasions and so on, they become conventionalized. And there are many conventionalized ostensive behaviors, interjections, emojis, pointing, nodding. You can add your own examples. And of course, sometimes those conventionalized means start to develop relationships with one another. They become networked together in various ways. Their forms and their functions become entwined with one another. And we call those networks languages. That's how I see the bigger picture. And again, I think it's given that ostension is a cognitive phenomenon, it's a stunning ability of humans that leads to downstream to the existence of languages. And the communicative principle of relevance I understand to be a law-like generalization about ostensive behavior. And I just want to, in passing, make the point that I've spoken to people not necessarily trained or using relevance theory, and they see it as sort of a peripheral theory about some marginal phenomena in pragmatics. And I just think that's not right. And I want to stress the value of law-like generalizations. They provide unity of understanding. They connect what are potentially very disparate phenomena in a cohesive way. They allow for novel predictions to be derived from general principles. And they tell us whether new findings integrate cleanly with existing knowledge, they accord with what we already know, or whether they're genuinely surprising and require revisiting fundamental theoretical ideas. So I think law-like generalizations, they're gold for science. We should be celebrating, they should be high-profile breakthroughs. And I think the communicative principle of relevance is such a thing. And in some ways, there are 50 people on this at this conference, and that's an outstanding effort on the behalf of the organizers, but I think it's quite a damning indictment of cognitive science as a much, much bigger community, that there aren't more people focusing on what I think is a major scientific advance. Okay, so the communicative principle of relevance, traditionally formulated as one statement: every ostensive stimulus conveys a presumption of its own optimal relevance. I've had the experience, a more simplified version, I should say, from that recent psych review paper: an act of ostensive communication elicits an expectation of its own relevance. So conveys a presumption, elicits an expectation. I've had conversations over the years where people, not necessarily trained in relevance theory, find these characterizations intriguing, but also maybe a bit mystical. I've been told it's opaque, it's not really a proper empirical claim, and worries of this kind. I think those worries are misfounded.
Yeah.
But thank you. The mic can be on if it's agreeing with me. I think those questions and worries are misfounded, but I do understand that language like conveys a presumption has a quasi-metaphorical character to it, and it might be useful to try and re-specify this principle that makes its empirical content a bit plainer. That's what I just said. Sometimes it's seen as a bit metaphorical. So, two empirical statements. I start not on the communicator side, but on the audience side. Audiences interpret stimuli that they perceive as ostensive as if it has a particular property, namely the property of optimal relevance, given the means and constraints that impact on the communicator. Sperber and Wilson use the language of abilities and preferences. I'm just using means and constraints because I find it more intuitive, but there's not meant to be a difference there. The key point is, sometimes, people ask, well, what if it's not optimally relevant? And the question doesn't entirely make sense, but even if it did make sense, it wouldn't matter. Audiences interpret stimuli perceived as ostensive as if they are optimally relevant, regardless of what qualities the stimuli actually have. That's just a fact about core cognition of humans. And then communicators, what they do is they indeed generate stimuli that, if they are interpreted in the ways that audiences actually do interpret things, are likely to generate interpretations that converge on the communicator's intended meaning. There's a lot of words here and a lot of jargon, but I think the empirical content is a bit plainer. What happens is you put these together, and then indeed you can say that ostensive stimuli convey a presumption of their own optimal relevance. That's a concise statement of what happens when you put these two empirical statements together. One advantage, as well as making the empirical content a bit plainer, one advantage is of putting it in two statements is it makes very clear that the cognitive capacities on the audience side and on the communicator side are absolutely interdependent. If audiences had these capacities and communicators did not behave in the ways that they do, then they would be completely useless, and indeed vice versa. And this interdependence has obvious implications for many issues, but in particular for issues in development and evolution. One way or another, the cognitive capacities must emerge together in ontogeny and evolve together in phylogeny. Exactly how they do are good and important questions. I've written in the past about how they might emerge together in, evolve together in phylogeny. There are different hypotheses about how they might emerge together in ontogeny, and those are important topics for exploration. Okay. I just want to say a few words here about means and constraints. As I said, Sperber and Wilson talk about abilities and preferences, and they make it clear that these abilities and preferences can be many and varied, but they tend not to, there's not too much elaboration in the original book on the range of abilities, preferences, means, constraints. So I just want to, I'm not going to spend too long here, but I just want to taxonomize a little bit. We could distinguish means are, things you might use for communication or expression. Constraints are limitations of one kind or another. And we can distinguish psychological means and constraints. So those are essentially things inside the mind, and ecological means and constraints, which are phenomena beyond the mind. And I'm not, I could talk for a long time about how all of these impact on communication in different ways, but they're many and varied. Just highlight a few perhaps of global means, so available to everybody, the whole body. Local means, objects available in the immediate environment. And we can taxonomize in various ways. And I highlight that because what I want to, I'm deliberately leaving it there so everybody can just browse the table. I'm highlighting this diversity to say this, just go back to the empirical statements. Audiences interpret stimuli perceived as ostensive as if the stimulus has the property of optimal relevance given everything that was on the previous slide, given all the means and constraints available. That is a fantastic ability of humans and as audiences. And then communicators, they generate stimuli that if they are interpreted in that way, taking into account everything on the previous slide, are indeed likely to generate interpretation that converge on the communicator's intended meaning. Again, it's a stunning ability. Now, maybe the last headline thing I want to say is that having understood the communicative principle of relevance as a pair of empirical claims, I think the empirical support for those claims is extremely wide and extremely deep. It's very well supported. I'm going to focus on this slide and the next on work that's non-linguistic, but I think a great deal of work that's done in the linguistic domain, traditionally in relevance theory, also supports those empirical claims. But as I say, I'm going to focus here. I'm just going to highlight one example, and I'll put a long list of citations on the next slide. This is work from some former colleagues of mine at Central European University. It's one lab working on joint action, and they've done a number of studies where, I'll just check the time, yeah, we're good. A number of studies where the task is to communicate one way or another a tune, a musical tune. And so what you have here is 8 notes on a xylophone, and you have a hammer, and you play the tune using the hammer. And you can manipulate, I won't go into all the details, but you can manipulate many things. You can manipulate whether people are playing the tune as a joint performance or trying to communicate it either to someone in front of them or to be recorded to be played to someone later. You can focus on the communicative side, or you can focus on the audience side. You can focus on the melody, which is the order of the notes, or you can focus on the rhythm of the tune, which is the relative timing of the notes. And by recording the hammer movements, you can then manipulate them with software using point light displays. You can exaggerate some movements. You can suppress some exaggerations. You can change what people actually do and see what differences that makes to how things are interpreted on the audience side. Many things you can manipulate, and what you find time and again at microscopic levels of fine-tuning is that people make adjustments and inferences all in line with the 2 empirical statements that I put on the previous slides. It's all in line with the communicative principle of relevance. And that's just studies focusing just on this very small paradigm of communicating musical tunes. There are, certainly dozens, maybe scores, even hundreds of empirical studies of various kinds that I think show test in different ways the empirical claims. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just some that came to mind. You'll see it's influenced. If you know my career history, it's influenced by people I've interacted with. But I think it's much, much broader than this. Okay. So to sum up, I'm well ahead of time. That's good. I think that ostension is best understood not as behavior, even though it's classically and often characterized that way, both by advocates and critics of relevance theory. It's better understood as a property of behaviors, and specifically as a property of being motivated by a communicative intention. And the communicative principle of relevance can be usefully respecified as a pair of empirical claims. And those empirical claims both have enormous empirical support. I think, as I said earlier, I think the communicative principle is a major breakthrough in cognitive science. And it's a great pity that it's not more broadly known. And I believe it should be.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to make sure, yes, because that's I can see your first slide right now,
Yeah.
but at the same time your last slide, right?
Yes. Again.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Tom, for your very interesting presentation. We have some time for discussions, and I can see a couple of hands, and I think Tim was the first.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I mean, I just completely agree with your sentiments, of course, about how there should be thousands of people here. So my question's really basic, and you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, and so what I want to really grasp, and I don't think I completely grasp, and I mean, it's really central for you, and I trust you that it is really central. So I'm not trying to ask a question that is in any way suggesting that anything that you've said is not appropriate or right. But here's the thing. So you can characterize a certain sort of behavior of any kind as a behavior that has a particular property. So when, for example, Deirdre and Dan write about ostensive behavior or ostension as a type of action, they are presumably meaning that ostensive behavior is behavior with the property of being ostensive, and ostensive action as an action, which is the type of action which has the property of being ostensive. And you can probably say the same thing about the Zebra's work about ostensive cues. So that's a fairly kind of simplistic way of talking about something which to you is a very major issue. So my point is, what do we gain, if you like, from seeing ostension as a property rather than a behavior which has a particular property? So that's what I really, that's a sort of fairly fundamental thing, and I kind of want to know what the difference is, if you like, and what you buy making that very subtle distinction. I hope that's clear.
It is clear. I'm just making notes about my own answers so I don't forget anything. Yeah, so I've got two answers, but I want to make a general point first before I do. Certainly, I don't know, I'll say something about Dan and Deirdre in a moment, but certainly in the comparative and developmental literature, there's definitely a tendency to treat ostension, certain behaviors as ostensive by definition. That's the notion of ostensive cues. And you'll see why I think that's a problem in a moment when I say what we gain. Dan and Deirdre is a bit more marginal. I mean, I went back, I should just ask them directly perhaps, but I went back to, the Relevance book, and I've looked in their papers, and I don't find an unambiguous, crystal clear statement, ostension is a property. To the extent that there is a clear statement, I find it to be ostension is a type of action. And maybe I'm reading more in there than they intend, and I should clarify that. So that's the general comment. So to answer the question, so there's two kinds of answers. What do we gain? First, I think it's just it's a win in itself to gain clarity over the natural character of things. What is the nature of things in the world? And I think just gaining clarity over that is a win in itself. With the second answer, you gain finer-grained experimental predictions, empirical predictions. So just the, again, I'm going to go to the developmental and comparative stuff because I know it better than other areas. One behavior that's often treated as ostensive in that literature is eye gaze. That's a go-to example. Right? Eye gaze is, and you see experimental studies where, individuals do things and then in one condition they add in eye contact, and that is sort of treated in the design as a button. If you press the ostensive button by making eye contact, that should give us different predictions. And as I say, I don't think that's quite right. It's not a behavior, it's a property of behaviors. And so it gives us this, I think my specification gives us this prediction. There should be occasions where eye contact is made, but if it's not motivated by communicative intention, it won't trigger the inferences that go with recognition of that. And so the go-to example here would be in the opticians. So an optician, so sometimes, I mean, I think it'd be hard to do experimentally, but I think it should be possible to make predictions that you can make eye contact with people unmotivated by communicative intention and thereby not trigger the inferences that we do classically associate with ostensive behavior. And I think, as I say, opticians are a real world example of that when they're looking directly into your eyes. But there are others too. So, to sum up, first, conceptual clarity is valuable in and of itself. Second, with that conceptual clarity, we get new and I think more fine-grained and better empirical predictions. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really clear. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we don't have to go to the optician for examples like that, do we? I mean, we on the tube in London, you regularly make eye contact, and nothing is, particularly in the UK, where we're not allowed to be ostensive to people we don't know. That's a really nice answer. Thank you, Tom. Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much. There's another question from Stavros.
Hi, Tom. Nice to see you. I hope all's going well. Okay, really quick, because I need to swap rooms for my own presentation. But I mean, if we are to define, not if we are, I mean, I agree with you completely 100%, but there is a sense in which action is not necessarily led by intention to a certain extent. Like if you think about like Austin's take on action, right? I mean, it's a conventional thing, right?
If you think about what, sorry, about?
John Austin.
Oh, Austin, yeah, okay, yeah.
Exact theory and the like, right? I mean, he was quite critical of intentionalist approaches and Grice and whatnot, and he wanted to showcase that there is a very huge element of conventionality, and I think that to a certain extent, the way we interpret things around us is also affected by convention a lot, right? I mean, language being the prime example of this. So I'm wondering whether that fits in your picture in any way. Or
yeah,
how.
it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. So, my work has often been critiqued, might not be the right word, but a common observation is I'm quite happy to use intentionalist language, and are you sure? Are you sure about that? And it's entailed by some of the points I made here. I was recently, I read a couple of papers by a guy, called Ronald Planer, one in particular, being Dennettian about Grice. And talking about Dennett's intentional stance, and what he does is he makes explicit something that was tacit, and I hadn't made explicit. I hadn't realized that that's what I thought until he'd spelled it out. But I think he's right. I'm using intentionalist language. It's only ever for me, and I wasn't clear about this previously, but it's only ever for me been intended to be at the computational level of analysis. So thinking about computational algorithmic physical levels of analysis. Intentional language is productive language. It's useful, it's clear at the computational level. How things are done algorithmically, I don't know. And all I want to do is to hand over good questions to neuroscientists and others. And I think by describing the relevant phenomena in intentional terms, we hand over good questions. How they choose to answer those questions is fascinating, but not my business.
Yeah, very clear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. For the moment, I cannot see any more hands, but actually I would like to ask you a question myself. And my question is about your notion of constraints, because you said you suggest that the original notion of abilities and preferences in the definition, maybe it would be more adequately reformulated in terms of means and constraints. Right. Yes. Well, I'm happy that you're showing these slides because actually I was also thinking about other relevance theoretic work done by Francisco Hughes, for instance, where he refers to all kinds of constraints like, speaker-based or context-based, contextual constraints, which are really not so much, they are not individual preferences, right? So, okay, I was just asking you to elaborate slightly on your notion of constraints.
Yeah, it's not intended as, so first, yeah, so it's not intended as a, like, this is the right way to think about the thing. This is how I think about it. My main point with this slide is to try and appreciate the full diversity of the factors that people take into account when they do the cognitive tasks that I talked about. I find means and constraints more useful than abilities and preferences, but it's not something I want to have a fight over. And this is one taxonomy, means versus and constraints, local versus global, ecological versus psychological, 2 by 2 by 2. I find it a useful taxonomy. If somebody wants to talk about speaker constraints and various other taxonomize things differently, again, I don't really have strong views. Maybe one extra point worth making here is this is connected to, so I've worked a little bit on cultural attraction theory, so has Dan Sperber, and factors of attraction are often in that literature often characterized in terms of global and local, ecological and psychological. So I'm alluding to the idea that the means by which humans do their interaction, they are culturally evolving phenomena, linguistic constructions being a great example, and they can be taxonomized in this way. But I don't, there's not a lot of theoretical weight placed on this particular taxonomy.
Thank you so much. I'm not thinking about it in terms of a taxonomy in the sense that there is a set of categories, but like, just observations made from different perspectives. So I think it just makes perfect sense to look at all kinds of constraints. And yeah.
I agree.
Okay, so I think once again, thank you so much, Thom, for your presentation, and thanks for the questions. I think we should try, because